Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling federalism in the U.S.
Right.
That, often debated way we divide power between the national government and the states.
hmm
Think of this not just as like a civics lesson, but really understanding the DNA of how decisions get made.
Exactly. And why your experience can be so different depending on where you live.
Totally.
You shared a chapter with us, and it's packed. Our goal is to go beyond just definitions and really dig into the why behind it all.
Yeah, how it shaped history, what it means now.
Mhm.
We're aiming for those aha moments.
That's the plan.
Okay, so at its core, what is federalism? It's more than just levels of government?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Federalism, basically, it sets up two distinct autonomous levels, national or federal and subnational state level.
Okay, autonomous.
And the key thing is, each one acts directly on the people. They have powers granted by the Constitution. It's not just a top-down thing.
So like two rule books, federal and state, covering different things, but both applying to us.
That's a good way to put it. And our source points out 5 common features you see in federal systems.
Okay.
First, 2 elected levels, different functions,
Hmm.
national handles, the big stuff defense, the economy overall.
Right.
States focus more locally, education, healthcare, public safety, but they have to cooperate.
Yeah, like federal environmental standards, but state agencies doing the legwork.
Exactly. Second, a written national constitution, and one that's hard to change, needs buy-in from the states.
Like our amendment process, 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of the states, super tough.
It really is. Which points to the stability they wanted. Third feature, formal allocation of powers, legislative, executive, judicial to both levels.
So Congress and the president federally, state legislatures and governor.
Right, parallel systems, but still interdependent. Think federal highway funds going to states.
Got it. Separate lanes, but they definitely merge sometimes. Fourth,
National courts to sort out disputes between the levels. For us, that's the Supreme Court, the ultimate umpire.
makes sense. If state and federal law clash, someone needs the final word.
Precisely. Keeps things consistent. And fifth,
What's the last one?
representation for the states in the upper house, the Senate. 2 senators per state, no matter the size.
Ah, right. Giving smaller states a bigger voice, proportionally. Deliberate choice.
Very deliberate. Ensures state interests are heard in federal lawmaking.
Okay. Now, the source contrasts this with unitary and confederal systems. Helps understand what federalism isn't. Unitary first.
Sure. Unitary systems, all the real power is at the national level. Any local or regional bodies get their power from the center.
Like administrative arms, basically.
Pretty much. Think the UK before they started devolving power more, or France, Japan. The central government holds the reins.
Okay. And a confederation, that's the opposite.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Power stays with the independent states. They create a central government, but it's weak, relies on state consent.
Like the U.S. under the Articles of Confederation.
The classic example. The national government couldn't really function effectively because states could just ignore it. That failure is why we shifted to federalism.
So federalism is that middle ground. Stronger national government than a confederation, but states still have real power, unlike a unitary system.
Exactly. A balance.
So let's look at the U.S. Constitution. How does it actually build this federal framework?
It's the blueprint. Article 1, Section 8, that lists Congress's enumerated powers.
A specific list.
Right. Taxing, borrowing, regulating interstate commerce, declaring war, coining money, all the things the Articles of Government struggled with.
And then there's the elastic clause. Necessary and proper. That seems important and controversial.
Hugely important. It lets Congress make laws necessary and proper to carry out those listed powers. It's flexible.
Flexible, yeah. And that, plus the Commerce Clause, is where a lot of federal expansion comes from.
Absolutely.
Right.
How broadly do you interpret necessary and proper or commerce? That's the ongoing debate. It allows the feds to get involved in areas not explicitly listed.
So federal rules on, say, air pollution, the argument is it affects interstate commerce, even if air pollution isn't in Article 1, Section 8.
That's often the justification, yeah. It connects back to regulating the economy.
Okay, so where do the states get their power defined?
Well, initially it was just assumed they kept all powers not given away, but the anti-federalists wanted it spelled out.
Which led to the 10th Amendment.
Exactly. It explicitly says powers not delegated to the U.S. nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states or the people. It's the cornerstone of states' rights.
The bedrock.
Right.
But you mentioned earlier, those lines have blurred. Even reserved powers aren't always exclusively state-run anymore.
They really aren't. Think education, health, safety areas traditionally state-run now see tons of federal involvement.
Through funding, mostly.
Funding, regulations tied to funding, yeah. And that broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause means lots of things, once seen as purely local, are now under the federal umbrella.
So less layer cake, more marble cake, like the source says.
Yeah.
Everything's kind of mixed together.
That's a very common way to describe it now.
What about powers both levels can use?
Concurrent powers. Taxing, borrowing money, making and enforcing laws, setting up courts. Yeah. Both federal and state governments can do these things.
Which sounds like it could lead to cooperation or conflict.
Both happen, definitely.
The Constitution also limits both levels, right?
Yes.
To protect liberty.
Yes, absolutely. Article 1, Section 9, and the Bill of Rights restrict the federal government, habeas corpus, no bills of attainder, things like that.
And states.
Article 1, Section 10, plus the 14th Amendment, put limits on states. Yeah. They can't make treaties, coin money, or deny due process or equal protection. And later amendments, like the 15th, 19th, 26th, stop states restricting voting based on race, sex, or age.
Okay. And then the big one, maybe the Supremacy Clause.
Oh.
Article 6, federal law is supreme.
In theory, yes. The Constitution and constitutional federal laws trump conflicting state laws.
But the catch is constitutional and conflicting.
Right. That's where the courts often come in. Look at marijuana legal in some states, illegal federally. That creates huge legal knots.
Yeah, businesses legal under state law are breaking federal law. What a mess.
It's a prime example of that tension.
How are states supposed to deal with each other? Full faith and credit clause.
That's Article 4, Section 1. States have to respect the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of other states, like a contract or a divorce decree.
The marriage equality fight really brought that clause into focus, didn't it?
It absolutely did. From state courts to Obergefell, it highlighted how crucial that interstate recognition is.
And privileges and immunities. That's about treating out-of-staters fairly.
Basically, yeah. States can't discriminate against citizens from other states regarding fundamental rights using courts, owning property, traveling.
But there are exceptions, like college tuition.
Right. In-state tuition, voting rights, sometimes access to certain welfare benefits, those can be limited to residents. But generally, it stops states from acting like separate little countries towards each other's citizens.
Okay, the constitutional setup is clear. But federalism in practice, a lot comes down to money, right?
Yeah.
How are the finances split?
Yeah, money talks. The source had 2014 data showing the federal government with the biggest revenue pot, then states, then local.
And the 16th Amendment, the federal income tax, that was huge.
Massive shift in 1913. It let the feds tax income directly without dividing it up based on state population. Gave Washington way more financial power.
Power to influence states, too, I bet, through grants.
Exactly. Federal grants are huge. Money flows from D.C. to states and localities, but usually with strings attached. It encourages states to follow federal goals.
So states get money, but they have to do what the federal government wants.
Often, yeah, or at least meet certain conditions. And it means federal dollars make up a bigger chunk of state and local budgets now than they used to.
Where does the money actually come from for each level?
For the feds, recent data shows individual income taxes and payroll taxes are the big sources, about 47% and 38% in 2020. States are more mixed. In 2018, taxes were the biggest slice, mostly sales and income tax, but federal aid was also substantial, around 25%. And states vary a lot. Some have no income tax, rely on sales, or like oil money.
Right, like Alaska or Florida.
Yeah. Local governments, property taxes are king there, made up about 72% of their tax revenue in 2018. They also get aid from the feds and states and charge for services.
So state and local governments really count on that federal money, especially when the economy tanks.
Definitely. During the Great Recession, federal aid ramped up significantly, helped plug budget holes.
And COVID?
Even bigger response. The CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan, massive federal aid went directly to states and cities, crucial for keeping services running.
Okay, so that's revenue. How is it all spent? What are the priorities?
Federal spending, looking at 2019, heavily weighted towards Social Security, healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid, and defense. Big chunks.
Social safety net and national security.
Pretty much. States and locals, education is huge for both, but states spend more on higher ed, locals on K through 12.
Makes sense.
Locals also spend more on police, fire, utilities. States spend more on public welfare, like healthcare support and highways. Interestingly, spending on courts and corrections is pretty similar between states and locals.
And you mentioned a trend about state funding for universities declining.
Yeah, as a percentage of university budgets, state funding has dropped. Some link it to things like online sales, eating into state sales tax revenue. It's complex.
So this intricate web of money flowing down, often with conditions attached. Let's shift to the history. How did this system evolve? The source outlines phases, starting with the early republic. Lots of tension then.
Oh, absolutely. Early days, up to the Civil War, it was a constant push and pull. Hamilton wanting a strong national government, Jefferson championing states' rights.
The national bank fight was central to that, wasn't it?
Classic example. Does the federal government have powers not explicitly listed? That was the core question.
And the Supreme Court weighed in early on, shaping things.
Big time. McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819. Huge. Chief Justice Marshall said, yes, Congress does have implied powers under the necessary and proper clause.
So the bank was constitutional.
Right. And crucially, states couldn't tax the federal government. The power to tax is the power to destroy. It cemented national supremacy in areas of conflict.
So McCulloch wasn't just about the bank, it was about implied federal power generally.
Yep.
And that's still debated.
Constantly. Arguments for federal action on, say, climate change often lean on implied powers. Opponents argue for a stricter reading of the Constitution. McCulloch's legacy is that ongoing debate.
Then Gibbons v. Ogden, 1824, that was commerce.
Interstate commerce. The court defined it very broadly, not just goods, but navigation, transport. Federal power over commerce between states was deemed supreme.
Laid the groundwork for a lot of later federal regulation.
Definitely did.
So early court decisions boosted federal power, but states pushed back hard. Nullification.
A major challenge. The idea that states could just nullify federal laws they didn't like. Calhoun pushed it hard during the tariff crisis in the 1830s.
South Carolina tried it.
They did. Jackson stared them down, threatened force. A compromise diffused it, but the idea didn't die. That tension over states' rights versus national authority kept building.
And ultimately exploded in the Civil War.
Absolutely. Slavery was the horrific core issue, but constitutionally the war was about whether states could leave the Union, reject federal authority.
And the Union victory settled that.
Decisively. No right to secede. And post-war amendments, 14th and 15th especially, expanded federal power and limited states. You can't ignore the pre-war Dred Scott decision here either, which denied federal power over slavery and territories, really fanned the flames.
Okay, Civil War cements national authority, but then comes dual federalism. What's that?
Late 1870s to the 1930s, think layer cake. National and state governments seen as operating in separate spheres, distinct powers, not much overlap.
And the Supreme Court enforced this separation.
Often, yes. They limited both federal and state power, reflecting that laissez-faire, hands-off economic thinking. Federal attempts to regulate industry, like antitrust laws, were interpreted narrowly.
Like the E.C. Knight case. Federal government couldn't regulate manufacturing under the commerce power.
Right. The court said manufacturing wasn't commerce. And Lochner v. New York struck down state labor laws protecting bakers, citing liberty of contract. Courts actively maintained those separate layers.
Until the Great Depression blew that model up. Enter cooperative federalism.
Exactly. The Depression was too big for states alone. FDR's New Deal required the federal government and states to work together. Think marble cake now, responsibilities all mixed up.
But the Supreme Court initially resisted the New Deal, based on that old dual federalism idea.
They did, struck down key programs, led to FDR's court-packing threat, but then the court shifted.
The switch in time that saved 9.
Sort of, yeah. Cases like NLRB v. Jones and Laughlin Steel upheld major New Deal laws, finding that things like labor relations did affect interstate commerce, broadened federal power significantly.
And this cooperative model continued, even expanded, with the Great Society.
Definitely. LBJ's programs in the 60s, Medicare, Medicaid, federal aid to education, civil rights laws, all involved deep federal-state cooperation, often with federal money setting national standards.
Like the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, huge federal actions in areas states used to control completely.
Absolutely. This era really cemented the marble cake and expanded the federal government's administrative reach through grants.
But then, a pushback again. New federalism starting in the 70s.
Right. Nixon, then Reagan especially. The idea was to reverse the flow of power, send more responsibility back to the states, decentralization for efficiency.
How did they try to do that?
Nixon used general revenue-sharing federal money with few restrictions. Reagan pushed for block grants, consolidating specific categorical grants into broader areas, giving states more flexibility.
The devolution revolution. Did it work?
Mixed results. There was political opposition, general revenue sharing ended, block grants increased for a while but didn't fundamentally remake the system, and the Supreme Court sometimes pushed back too, like in Lopez, limiting the Commerce Clause power.
So, not a complete return to the past, but an attempt to rebalance. And since then, kind of back and forth.
Pretty much. Post 9/11 saw a swing back toward federal power, Homeland Security, TSA, then big federal initiatives like No Child Left Behind, the Affordable Care Act. But debates over state roles in immigration, environment, and healthcare continue. It's dynamic.
It really shows federalism isn't fixed. It's always being renegotiated. Let's talk about the tools the feds use to interact with states day to day. Grants and mandates.
The main tools, yeah. Grants are the financial carrots incentives for states to do things the federal government wants.
And mandates.
Those are the sticks. Requirements imposed on states, often without the money to pay for them, unfunded mandates.
Okay, grants first. How have they changed?
Early on, land grants for railroads, universities. Then cash grants became dominant in the 20th century.
Different type.
Yeah. Categorical grants are for specific things. Strict rules often need state matching funds, think Medicaid. Block grants are broader, more flexible, like for workforce development. General revenue sharing was the most flexible, but it's gone now.
And federal grant money has grown a lot, especially for healthcare.
Hugely. And the feds tend to prefer categorical grants, gives them more control over how the money's used.
Makes sense from their perspective. Now, those unfunded mandates, states must hate those.
Generally, yes. They've increased since the 60s. Environment, civil rights, education, homeland security. Things like the Clean Air Act often set federal standards that states have to enforce.
Any pushback on that?
Yeah, the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, UMRA, in 95 tried to make it harder, require cost analysis. But mandates continue. The Real ID Act, standardizing driver's licenses, was a big, costly one for states.
So it's kind of coercive federalism sometimes, using mandates as much as grants.
That's the term some use, yeah. Creates friction. The Clery Act, requiring campus crime reporting, is another mandate tied to federal funding eligibility.
Okay, carrots and stick. Now, this idea of competitive federalism today, what's that about?
It's where the lines between federal and state roles are blurry and fought over. Immigration, LGBTQ+ rights are good examples.
And groups trying to influence policy pick the level of government where they think they'll win. Venue shopping.
Exactly. If you lose in Congress, try the state legislatures. Or go to court. You shop for the best venue.
Give us an example of that playing out. Immigration.
Definitely. Feds traditionally controlled it, but states started getting much more involved, especially with laws impacting undocumented immigrants. Arizona's SB 1070 was a flashpoint state trying to enforce federal law.
And the Supreme Court stepped in.
In Arizona v. United States, yeah. Said the feds are largely supreme on immigration policy, struck down parts of the Arizona law, but let others stand with warnings. Showed the ongoing fight. California went the other way, offering state aid.
And LGBTQ+ marriage rights. Similar dynamic.
Very similar. Federal DOMA tried to define marriage nationally. States passed bans. Then courts got involved. Windsor struck down part of DOMA, emphasizing the state's traditional role in marriage.
Which opened the door for more states to allow same-sex marriage.
Right, leading eventually to the nationwide ruling in Obergefell, a real tug-of-war between federal action, state action, and the courts.
And venue shopping examples. ABD.
Mothers Against Drunk Driving. They started at the state level, trying to raise the drinking age. Hit resistance.
So they went federal.
Yep. Lobbied Congress, got the National Minimum Drinking Age Act passed. It tied highway funds to states raising the age to 21. Classic use of federal leverage. All states eventually complied.
Clever. And anti-abortion groups.
Similar strategy shift. After Roe v. Wade, they focused on Congress initially, didn't get far, so they pivoted to state legislatures.
Where they've had more success enacting restrictions.
Much more. Things like waiting periods, parental notification laws, a clear example of shifting venues to achieve policy goals.
Okay, so it's a complex, competitive system. Let's zoom out. What are the big advantages of federalism overall?
The source points to policy innovation as a key one, states as laboratories of democracy.
Trying things out on a smaller scale.
Exactly. Child labor laws, women's suffrage started in states. California's emission standards influenced federal rules. State health exchanges informed the ACA.
Allows experimentation. What else?
More opportunities for political participation. Tons of state and local elected offices means more ways for you to get involved, influence policy closer to home. People often trust state and local government more, too.
And it accommodates diversity.
Right. In a big, diverse country, states can tailor policies to local needs and values. You see differences in gun laws, alcohol rules, welfare benefits, state by state.
Allows for variation. Okay, what about the downsides?
Big one is economic disparities. Huge differences between states in income, school funding, healthcare access. Federalism can make it harder to equalize things nationwide.
And the race to the bottom.
Yeah, states competing for businesses by lowering taxes or regulations, which might hurt workers or the environment. Or states hesitant to expand things like Medicaid because they worry about costs or attracting people needing
It
services.
creates perverse incentives sometimes.
Can do. And finally, it can just be hard to get things done on big national problems. All the checks and balances, divided power. It can lead to gridlock, slow responses. We saw challenges to the New Deal, the ACA, voting rights. Federalism can hinder unified national action.
So innovation and responsiveness on one hand, inequality and potential gridlock on the other. A real trade-off.
That's the fundamental tension.
Well, we have certainly dug deep into federalism, covered the core ideas, the history, the money, the fights, the pros and cons. It's clearly not simple, and it's always changing.
Absolutely. It shapes so much of American politics and daily life. Understanding how that power is divided and how that division shifts is crucial.
Right. So final thought for you, our listener. We've talked about this constant push and pull. Now think about the future. Issues like climate change, AI, pandemics, things that ignore state borders. How will American federalism cope? What are the biggest pressures coming? And how might this system, this fundamental structure, need to adapt? We hope this deep dive gave you a solid framework for thinking about those huge questions. Thanks for joining us.